Well, hello there. This week we're going to look at understanding congregations as emotional systems. Uh, some of this work here is adapted from how your church family works and understanding your congregation as a system. So, some introductory thoughts. When we speak of the church, we often use biblical metaphors like the body of Christ, the new Israel, flock, etc. And if I'm speaking personally, we may speak of the church with terms such as warmth and relationship, a community, a family, a gathering. When we move from metaphor to reality, however, we begin to run into problems. These great metaphors we have often that we often use get tarnished. We've probably all experienced bitterness, suspicion, anger, jealousy, deception, coercion, or apathy. Yet the church is holy, set aside for God's purposes, and yet it is ordinary and subject to the humanity that is such a part of it. The church really is somewhat of a paradox. Some of the best things that have ever happened to me have happened in the church. Some of the worst things that have ever happened to me have happened in the church. When we reflect on our metaphors, we need to remember that there is nothing wrong with them. But we often fail to remember that the church functions as an emotional system. As long as humans gather and interact, emotional processes will occur. There are great things about this: joy, comfort, support, cooperation, and friendship, but we also know that emotional systems are inherently anxious. It is this anxiety that often distracts the congregation from its purpose, sets people at odds with each other, and builds walls against outsiders. It is false to assume that the church, as a relationship system, will function differently than human interactions experienced in our lives. While the presence of the Spirit and the forgiveness of sin distinguish a church's life, neither negates anxiety. Peter Steinke says this: the church is more than its emotional processes, but is never less than these processes. Thomas Aquinas stated, gratia non telit naturam. Grace does not abolish nature. However that may be true, we must also remember that grace redirects human nature. Grace offers courage in the face of human nature. It is our hope. We're not asked to live an unreal life in the church, but we are urged to control the powers of human nature. But that is not the same as denying their reality. The presence of anxiety in a church is a given. Ignoring this reality is not a sign of faith, much less wisdom. Rather, in my estimation, this is a sign of foolishness. The key question that Steinke asks is whether or not anxiety, so much a part of these processes, infects the relationship, bringing about discord and destruction. We need to pay attention to and work through the presence of anxious forces in the church. So it is important to conceptualize emotional processes so that we can recognize them and ultimately let them serve rather than corrupt the purposes of bonding us together. The church is not a family in the traditional sense. Nevertheless, it is an emotional unit. The same emotional processes experienced in our families operate in the church. So let's cover some basic concepts, sort of a review as we wrap everything up. We need to remember that when we get right down to it, programs, methods, etc., are only that: programs and methods. Ultimately, it is God who brings about the change. It is God who enters into our lives and makes the difference. So, as helpful as systems theory is, it is just that. It's a theory. Reality is more complex than theory. However, a theory does allow us to organize complexity. From a place of reference, we put the forces into a coherent pattern. We see how things are connected. We try to make sense of what is happening, and we become more aware of how we might respond and focus our efforts. Systems theory is just a way of conceptualizing reality. It considers the interrelatedness of the parts. Now, systems thinking deepens our understanding of life. Once we understand this theory, we're able to see the rich complexity of the interdependent parts. Basically, a system is a set of forces and events that interact. To think systemically is to look at the ongoing, vital interaction of the connected parts. So a good axiom to keep in mind here is this: the whole is greater than the parts. Think of our bodies composed of lungs and heart, pancreas, muscles, bones. While each part is pretty fascinating, taken together, the body is rather impressive. It is greater than any separate organ. I would encourage you to go read 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and following. Paul makes a similar claim about the individuals who make up the body of Christ. Now, let me say a word about systems thinking versus straight line thinking, linear thinking. When we think systemically, we cannot understand one thing without the other. A and B are indivisible. They cannot be divided. Instead of A causing B, we see that A and B are mutual influences on each other. The influence goes back and forth. So systems theory teaches us to think in loops rather than in straight lines. A and B are both influence and influenced. They are co-causal. So we look at how A and B mutually maintain their connection or their interaction, not for who causes what. Straight line thinking is appropriate when dealing with mechanics and physical objects, but we're often guilty of mistaking what happened in the world of objects to what happens in the world of the living. In the physical world, causality is linear. Like billiard balls, one ball strikes another, causing it to move. One force acts upon another, but billiard balls have no response mechanism. In the world of the living, more than mere force is involved. Action provides information. People respond or they react to it. A response is a choice. It is intentional. A reaction is automatic. It is reflexive. Consider the difference between kicking a rock and kicking a dog. Systems theory not only considers how interactions are mutually influenced, but also how they become patterned or repeated. Established patterns are called homeostasis. We've covered this before. Consider our bodies once more. We have internal means that seek the most favorable conditions for survival. Our internal environment must remain fairly constant. Slight variations from the norm endanger our health. And biologically, we have homeostatic forces that work to maintain temperature, our levels of fluids, our salts, and our blood sugar. To ensure this homeostasis, that the body functions as a cooperative community, preventing it from being overwhelmed by changing conditions. Consider what happens when a virus enters the body. The homeostatic forces go to work to restore the balance. Externally, we need stabilizing forces as well. Keeping traditions and following rules are homeostatic forces. There is more range for adaptation, however, as slight deviations from the norm are not necessarily life-threatening, and I'll argue that change is in fact necessary for survival. Living things grow and develop. But relationships require stability. To maintain this, we develop patterns to ensure reliable, continuous interaction. When that pattern is disturbed, we are said to experience some amount of shock, like a culture shock, akin to when I was first went in the Army, moving from California to Tennessee. That was culture shock. We tend to be creatures of habit, and while we need continuity and sameness, we also need to be flexible. Living things grow and develop. There is a time for homeostasis, and there is a time for asking, why are you holding the horses? Systems thinking instructs us at how the whole is all connected, wired together. In a human system, the parts are arranged in a whole through functioning positions. By functioning in a specific way, each person contributes to the system's balance. Or think of a body, each component of the body contributes to the body's systemic balance. As long as everyone or everything functions in the same way, the arrangement is stable. Consider the parent-child relationship. This relationship is structured for the welfare of the child. As the child matures, less parental oversight is needed, and the interactions between the two change. For some families, the transition is smooth. For other families, this is a bit more tumultuous. Relationship systems can be arranged in many ways. The three most common arrangements are complementary, contrary, and sorry, I just lost my place, and similar. Now, these arrangements are maintained by mutual functioning, but disturbed by new ways of behaving. So let's think about complementary. Steve acts helpless. Amy takes care of him. Steve believes it will rain on every parade. Amy always looks for sunshine. Kind of complement this opposites attract kind of deal. Contrary. Steve says blue, which means Amy will say red. Steve hates wearing ties. Amy buys him a tie on every gift-giving occasion. Here, contrary, think of intimate enemies. What about similar? If Steve says blue, Amy will say blue. Steve and Amy never go to parades for fear of rain. Think of birds of a feather flock together. What most distinguishes relationship systems from other systems are emotional processes. These processes are driven by and organized around two forces: the need to be separate, that is, to be alone, to stand on our own 2 feet, and the need to be close, that is, to be together, to stand hand in hand. These two forces are in tension, and they are anxiety producing. How can you stand alone and still embrace another? How can you be close to someone and lose yourself or maintain yourself? How can you go in both directions? Consider adolescents. When they enter into mid-adolescence, developmentally, they need to become independent. This is both healthy and good, but at the same time, they must maintain relationships with others so that they can develop the independence. Consider the position of a pastor who was good friends with a lay leader. Then they come down at some point on different sides of a budget issue. The pastor favors funding the new program, but the lay leader commands a group that favors wanting to upgrade the facilities. Will the pastor risk the continued support of the leader or bow to the lay leader's position? And then a word about self-differentiation. Bowen introduces this term to depict the capacity of maintaining two forces in balance. It is, as we have said in previous times, defining yourself and staying in touch with others, being responsible for yourself and responsive to others, maintaining your integrity and well-being without intruding on that of others, allowing the enhancement of another's integrity and well-being without feeling abandoned, inferior, or less of self, having an I and entering a relationship with another I without losing yourself or diminishing the self of the other. It means being separate together or being connected selves. And this, as I've said before, is a lifelong process. Self-differentiation never happens in isolation. It requires other people. Both forces, separateness and closeness, are always positions vis-a-vis others, positions of dialogue, positions of give and take, of alongsideness. Now let me say some things, speak some to anxiety and reactivity. As I've said before, all relationship systems become anxious. Got an ice cube. Put people together and anxiety will rise. It can be infectious. We can give it to others or we can catch it from them. But what precisely triggers anxiety is unique to each system. Common activators are significant losses and significant changes. These upset the stable patterns and balance of the system. Equally important as to what sets off anxiety is where that anxiety is focused. Anxiety is free-floating, but it will eventually drain off and settle. Often the most vulnerable or responsible people in the relationship network are the usual targets. Anxiety can be the ruin or salvation of our relationships. It often functions as an alarm, alerting us to potential danger, but sometimes it goes off too quickly. It makes transparent what is not alike. It magnifies differences, and differing, by the way, differing can be a synonym for discord. Anxiety affects most adversely the relationship systems that have little capacity to tolerate or manage differences. However, anxiety can be a form of deliverance. It has motivational power, it provokes change, pushes towards innovation or transformation. If, however, it reaches a certain intensity, it prevents the very change it provokes. What has the stimulus? What has the stimulus? What has been the stimulus? Can become the restraint. Anxiety is emotional pain. It constricts and limits life. It diminishes clarity and objectivity. In contrast to fear, anxiety is undifferentiated. It has no definite focus. We might speak of agoraphobia, the fear of open spaces, and claustrophobia, the fear of enclosed spaces. But anxiety is an imprecise warning signal. It has no object, yet continue to scream without warning. Since anxiety affects our thinking capacities, we should take some time to discuss the working of the brain. The architecture of the brain is three-tiered. The base of the brain, where the central nervous system connects with the brain stem, is known as the reptilian brain. Above it lies what scientists would refer to as the mammalian brain, also known as the limbic system. And the largest brain area, the third area, is the neocortex. Each part of the brain has its own function, but the three function as one. So the reptilian brain regulates the automatic processes such as circulation and respiration. It functions regularly and continuously. Its mechanisms are biologically designed for protection and survival. The mammalian brain, the second tier, regulates behavior. That includes playing, nurturing, bonding, and flocking, as well as emotive expressions such as shock and repugnance and sorrow and rejoicing. And this brain, also operates without premeditation. This part of the brain plays a mediating role between pleasure and pain, tension and relaxation, fight and flight. At times, however, the limbic system can oscillate. Now, these two parts of the brain compose about 15% of the brain mass. Involved with involuntary responses, they operate like clockwork. But being automatic, they cannot be inventive. Being reactive, they cannot be creative. The cerebral hemisphere encompasses 85% of the brain mass. This supreme tier processes concepts and symbols and insights. It is associated with voluntary movements. Neocortical thinking is adept at learning new ways to cope and at imagining new alternatives. Another way to think of this is like this. The neocortex is the thinking cap. Analyze, reflect, symbolize, observe, create. The mammalian brain is the house of emotion. Love, hate, bond, play. The reptilian is the automatic pilot. Survive, act without thinking. So two processes here. Humans share the reptilian brain with lizards and the like, and the mammalian brain with dogs and such. However, in humans, these two parts are superior to the same structures in lower species. The two self-preserving parts of the brain are not inferior to the thinking part merely because we share them with lesser species. They do contribute to life, but they are limited. The lower brain, the automatic processes to defend, to discharge, to preserve, to protect or react. The hemispheric brain, the thinking processes to define, to discriminate, to create, to respond. But let's think of some negative outcomes, though. Moved by gusts of anxiety, we can experience what Friedman calls a reptilian regression. We are reactive. Automatic processes take charge. Impulse overwhelms intention. Instinct sweeps aside imagination. Reflexive behavior closes off reflective thought. Defensive postures block out defined positions. Emotional reactivity limits clearly determined direction. At the onset of threat, self-preservation has more relevance for survival than self-awareness. In this state of regression, the reptilian brain joins forces with the mammalian and it dominates. Anxious, we are apt to lose objectivity and civility. We are in a position to be neither responsible nor loving. In periods of intense anxiety, what is most needed is what is most unavailable: the capacity to be imaginative. This is true in the church family as it is in all relationships. Threatened, we tend to dispense with Christian convictions and values. So, situational or habitual. There are two types of anxiety, and each leads to different results: acute or chronic. Now, acute anxiety, as I've said before, is crisis generated. It is situational or time-based. In a church, it may appear when there are budgetary concerns, loss of minister, a sudden influx of new members, significant change in lay leadership. Acutely anxious systems, or people, though, regain their perspective. There is a return to the thinking cap. They have a capacity to control their reactivity. Chronic anxiety, however, is habitual. It can't put it to rest. Even the slightest change or a trivial annoyance incites reactive behavior. It is no longer just a warning signal, it is structured into life. Chronically anxious churches will have small groups splinter off periodically. They may stay intact, but are submissive, but is submissive to a small but manipulative power group. Leadership changes rapidly, or change is always stalled. They are not self-regulating. They are not imaginative. Typical of chronic anxious people is the tendency to resort to either or, yes, no, or black-white thinking. With little capacity for discernment, the chronically anxious reduce everything to all or nothing. The lines are drawn. It is no wonder that they overfocus on others and their weaknesses. These people, if they do not get their way, make hostages of their gifts, their money, their tithe, their attendance, and their participation. They employ their stewardship as brinkmanship. Their ultimate threat is to run away from home, transferring or terminating their membership. They have a low tolerance for pain. They hanker for answers and comfort. Threatened, they make demands, they spread rumors, they exaggerate circumstances, they claim injustice. Governed by instinct rather than insight, they cannot be stopped by reasoning or appeasing. Someone has anxiety if acute. Someone is anxiety if chronic. There is a vicious circle. Anxiety is not necessarily harmful to relationship systems. It does have the potential to transform relationships beneficially. However, when anxiety explodes into reactive behaviors and is mutually reinforced, a vicious cycle forms. So, a person becomes anxious. Let's call that person A1. Feeling insecure, the person reacts, R1. In the face of the initial person's anxious reactivity, a second person becomes anxious, A2, and reactive, R2. If anxious reactivity continues to be fed in both directions, it becomes reinforced and maintained. The individuals become unbending. Think of rigid here. Once inflexible, they polarize, but polarity itself produces anxiety. This process continues until someone frees themselves from the loop or someone from outside the emotional circle intervenes into the feedback pattern. Vicious circles can only be disabled through exposure. They are enabled by secrecy and avoidance. So let's spend a few moments thinking about separateness and closeness. I want you to think back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. Everything was together. The air mingled with the water, the sky blended with the earth. You could not distinguish from hot and cold, hard from soft, wet from dry. With everything thrown together, confusion covered the land, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. When God separated one thing from another, the formless mass took shape. God set boundaries between the land and the sea, the day and the night. Out of this undifferentiated mess or mass came order and stability. Still, creation remained unfinished. So, to the creature, the Creator assigned the task of naming things. Taha Adam. Adam sorted things out. This is horse. This is cow. The apples do not go with the oranges. This is red. That is green. He made comparisons between wood and stone. When things are identified, defined, and classified, they stand out and become distinctive. As the Genesis story unfolds, the process of separating one thing from another continues. Man and woman are to leave their parents and form a new unit. Two people join together and become one. In the Genesis story of creation, we see the foreshadowing of the drama of human development, learning to be separate yet close. To be separate and to be close are basic needs. One personal, the other relational. A major task of our life is to be able to shift between the two. We need to activate our uniqueness, our sense of self. We exist to be distinct from others, not distant from them. Without separateness, we cannot know diversity, creativity, or longing. We separate in order to unite. We become distinct so that we can connect. Community means two unique people meet, not two fuzzy people merge. This is the fundamental idea conveyed by the word relate. It bears the notion of carrying back. We reach out and are reached. In a relationship, what is separate is brought back. Genuine separateness is differentiation within a relationship. To stand aloof is emotional distance. Likewise, genuine closeness is always chosen. It is not driven, forced, or obligated togetherness. Two people swallowing one another is not a relationship. That's emotional fusion. The two needs of life, separateness and closeness, are opposites. They are forces in tension. They are anxiety producing. And the more intense our anxiety, the more extreme our positions. We then become too remote or too entangled. All extremism inevitably fails because it consists in excluding and denying all but a single point of the entire vital reality. We are who we are because of our history. We were conceived from shared passion. We were welcomed and nurtured by a distinct family. We are catechized into an inherited worldview. We must say, I am who I am because I am the child of this pair of parents, grew up at a certain period of time with a certain group of siblings, if any siblings, lived in a specific neighborhood, attended school A, and not B, worked in a particular job, married a certain person, resided in this place and not somewhere else, established a special circle of friends, experienced these events rather than those. The self we have is a self forged in particular community. Think of those microsystems. We're not born in a vacuum, but onto a stage. The drama has been enacted for millennia, shaping the story that we are about to live. We can't abolish the cast of characters, the stage, the props, the plot we inherit. The setting is set. We are always inheritors of the history of generations. To the philosopher's words, know thyself must be added in the context of your family and generations before. Like relay runners, we pass the torch of emotional processes from one generation to the next. When you worked on your genogram, I think you saw this thinking at work. We learned about the capacities of families to regulate their anxiety in the face of the tension between separateness and closeness. The church as an emotional system has its own drama. It too confronts the perennial human needs of separateness and closeness in relationships. The church family has its distancers in the narrative and the quitters. It has its share of fusers who consider the church family to be their property. Church people act out of their own unfinished agendas in other relationships with members of the congregation. Some are intent on haranguing others so that they don't have to change themselves. Some are forever cheating others of their birthright for their own special place in the family. Others form a crankiness crowd looking for external conditions to explain their own unhappiness. Remember the blaming you. And what church doesn't have a group of people who, fearful of differences and differing, brighten the family's life and distract it from the threatening storm clouds? So, finally, stability and change. Systems need calm and coherence. They tend to react swiftly to sudden shifts and marked differences. The survival instincts prevents them from being overwhelmed by unexpected or excessive change. However, when tested and challenged, systems move toward self-preservation, though their emotional reactivity will vary in intensity and duration. It really is not a sign of defectiveness or evil for a system to protect itself against what it cannot accommodate. Reactivity is in the service of survival. But what is automatic is intended to be temporary, not permanent. If anxiety is reinforced and it takes hold, it is locked into the system, and then after a while the system may even become loyal to its own reactivity. When anxiety is high, resilience is low. Behaviors are extreme and rigid, thoughts are unclear and disjointed, anxious people speak harsh words or cut themselves off from others through silence, and to manage their threatening situation, people hurry to localize their anxiety. They blame and criticize. Once a system fortifies its stability by its reactivity, it cannot get what it needs most: time and distance, calm and objectivity, clarity and imagination. It gets caught in its own automatic processes. Therefore, a system that maintains its stability by reactivity alone will not be stable in the long run. Continuous reactivity creates three processes that prevent the system from being resourceful and flexible: a shrinking perspective, a tightening of the circle, and a shifting of the burden. A system needs change as well as stability. Living things grow and develop. They are not static. One of the most effective ways to introduce change is to redefine the problem, to see the whole pattern of interaction. And remember, you cannot change anyone. You cannot change the system. You can only change yourself. As long as there is blaming, it is nearly impossible to institute change. Blaming is a sign that people are stuck in their instinctive nature. That's something to pay attention to. The blame game resembles an ancient religious practice called divination, locating the source of evil, which is always, by the way, believed to be outside of oneself, and then eliminating that evil. So a few words on considering the congregation, understanding the congregation as an emotional system. Put all of this together with what you've learned, you have some pretty significant insights on how to navigate the systems of which you're a part. Blessings and peace.